So we're going to start the presentation and workshop with a few slides from me and a few slides from Antonio Roberts at CoMoUK, just to kind of frame why we're having this webinar, what kind of discussion we're hoping to get out of the back of it. So we're hosting this as the DecarboN8 Network. Most of you will have been contacted through the network, so I won't say an awful lot about it, but it's a Research Council funded network to try and stimulate collaborative research and acceleration of decarbonisation policy, particularly across the north, but not exclusively. We're hoping that the work we do will be nationally and internationally important and relevant. Okay, so introduction and aims for the day. Well, obviously we're focusing today on shared mobility as one of the many different parts of the future mobility system which need to be decarbonised. And in various discussions that I've been involved in over the last couple of years, you know, and I'm not someone who's as embedded in the field as many of the people on the call here today, but there has been a growing acknowledgement of the importance of shared mobility to rethinking what our transportation systems look like and will need to look like. And I think in the UK we've got some amazing companies and innovations that have been showing the way on how to move away from individualized car ownership and use. And there are some great prospects out there for where things could go, but it's still relatively niche in terms of overall travel that is captured certainly through formal shared mobility systems. And we're at a point where technology is beginning to enable different combinations of shared mobility to be put together, obviously things like mass platforms and so on. So where shared mobility will be in 5 years' time is not where we've come from. So the individual services which have been developed have been where we've kind of mostly focused our effort, but now I think we're beginning to see thoughts about a more integrated ecosystem. So how do we move from niche to really mainstream? And the questions that we've been asked to sort of think about and have been challenged by government, by industry partners, by CoMoUK is the evidence base strong enough on shared mobility systems to really cut through and make a difference with policymakers, to make the investment cases, to make the case for allocating more space when it's required, and so on. And there's a question there. I mean, I've had that discussion from many different angles, but who do we need to convince and about what? Is this things which internally within the industry we're not happy about? Is this government asking questions of the various different parts of the industry? And how do we answer those concerns so that we can move this debate on, so that we can actually embed shared mobility more in government policy? So the shared mobility report, which I led on, which was out last year, I can't even remember what day of the week it is anymore now, but it was out last year, looked at the huge potential for shared mobility in different dimensions. It's just one of the infographics from there, just how important how much we were able to get sharing of vehicles is to our future travel demands. So 5% if we can increase occupancy by 0.2, 55% if it declines by 0.2. So really, I mean, the scale of what that means for infrastructure investment, for carbon emissions, for other impacts is just enormous. So the prize is really, really high. Obviously, In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Decarbonising Transport Setting the Challenge document put out there. Accelerating modal shift to public and active transport is one of the strategic priorities. So it's seen to be a core area, and you can see explicitly supporting fewer car trips through coherent, convenient, cost-effective public network, and exploring how we might use cars differently in the future. But how does it go from being a box in a strategic priority to being something that actually does claim the attention that it deserves? If we were to classify how we think about this at the moment, is we've grown up with different systems of provision. So whether that's car clubs or lift sharing or bike hire schemes, we've tended to think about the users of those particular systems. So if you look at even the history of Car Plus, Bike Plus, and now, which is now CoMoUK, we were conducting and still conducting surveys of car club users and bike share use. So obviously in the future, these systems are going to be more part of an integrated ecosystem. And so is it right to focus on the users of individual systems, or do we need to be thinking more about making the case of how these systems make a difference when put together in combinations? I think that's a challenge then to the evidence base that we've currently got, which is strong in its own particular dimensions, but clearly has some other weaknesses. And we need to think as well beyond just like thinking about systems, but thinking about the places in which they're deployed. So this is data from Leeds, and it won't be that much different in other places, but you can find areas of Leeds which have got fewer than 10% of households without any cars, and you can find other places that have got 50-60% of households that don't have access to cars. So you know, the environment into which these systems are being deployed is also not very uniform. Tends to be more of a focus to date on more city centre based schemes, but there are a lot more interesting use cases now which are being shown to be possible through technology and through new partnerships. How do we actually blend that kind of evidence with what we have today? So those are really just some of the discussions which led us to helping to put on and facilitate this webinar and workshop. And I'm going to hand over to Antonia to give a brief kind of context setting before we get you to go around, introduce yourselves, and tell us about what you think the challenges are. So I'll pass on to Antonia for the next bit.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I think most of you on the call are very familiar with CoMoUK, but there's a few of you that might not be aware of our work. So just in case, we are a charity, and we exist to promote and support the development of all shared mobility modes, so namely car clubs, ride sharing, bike sharing, but increasingly new modes as well, like e-scooter sharing, demand responsive transport, and crucially the tools and the environment that help to knit those together. So we've got a picture of mobility hubs there, mobility as a service, all of those themes that help to make shared transport a success. So as well as myself on the call today was Richard Dilks, our chief exec, who'll be helping to run workshops later in the session. I really wanted to thank Greg and the team for hosting these series of workshops. I think it's going to be really useful, particularly as we shift our focus to thinking about carbon emissions and seeing how the research that we've done could help to be adapted to this kind of changing environment that we've got. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes sort of thinking about the kind of work that research that we've done and setting out some of our thoughts on where to go next, really. So as many of you know, we have been conducting user surveys of car club users for many years now, split geographically for London, England, Wales and Scotland. And they are combined alongside analysis of operators to make the annual surveys each year. And then over the last 4 years, we've also been doing bike share user surveys. With the last year, we split out the Scotland results of those as well. We have limited published results around ride sharing, a little bit of work being done there. And we've also got some early discussions going on about measuring the impacts of demand responsive transport going on. So drilling down into what we've learnt by looking at those surveys, particularly in relation to carbon. So in terms of car clubs, we do a joiner survey and a core membership survey. And through that, we collect lots of evidence about behaviour change. But in relation to carbon, we look at people's car mileages. So the before and after picture, but also in terms of like their private use as well as their car club use. We ask people about their car ownership, whether they've sold cars or avoided buying cars as a result of, or indeed bought a car as a result of joining a car club. And then what were the typical age and fuel types of those cars and how that then compares to the car club fleet's emissions themselves. And looking at in a kind of wider context of what are the changes they've made to their transport use of other modes as well, and they're interested in other shared modes. In terms of bike sharing, there is just one survey, although we do split out some questions about e-bikes. The sample sizes for that have been relatively small so far, but certainly we can see there's big potential there for e-bikes to make even bigger differences. I think that's particularly relevant to the carbon question. So we asked people about whether the bike sharing was a catalyst to them cycling, how it's affected their rates of cycling. We talked to them about their previous mode for their main journey, which is actually quite often car or taxi. The results of that are surprisingly high, and their changes in car use as a result of joining the scheme are more significant than you might imagine. And we also asked them about how they use bike sharing in conjunction with other modes, which then also enables them to reduce car use. In addition, we've done some other bits of research which might be relevant to these discussions that we're going to have. We've looked at mosaic profiles of users so that we're more aware of the typical types of people that we might attract to these types of modes. And then over the last year, we've done a couple of bits of research about the potential for the sectors. So one bit of work in London, which has looked at what types of households may be able to switch to a car club, i.e. they're low car users. And a sort of similar exercise we did in Scotland, but we actually, as well as looking at car clubs, we looked at trips that either had lots of similar people doing similar trips that could switch to ride sharing, or were short enough that they might be attracted to bike sharing. Now they are relatively crude bits of research because the context in which we're looking at will make such a big difference. But we were generally looking at, well, what could be the maximum potential if you had all the right factors in place, and therefore what could the impacts be, particularly in terms of carbon. So those bits of research are available now as well. So just wanted to spend a couple of minutes now talking about what we think some of the limitations are to where we're at. So just to be clear, I think that we're very happy with the evidence that we've published in terms of the fact that it's very solid. There's the actual response rates are always really good, and we've got so many years of data. But in terms of the broad behaviour change that we've recorded, I think there are very clear patterns there. But actually, when you start to think about carbon reduction, we then might want to spend a bit of time drilling down to more of the detail and looking at some of the calculations that we do use to make those more accurate. So a few points here, particularly in relation to the car club survey. Obviously, we're relying on people's memory in terms of how they record their previous mileage, unless they're keen and look up their MOT certificates, etc. So although there is a strong kind of bank of data there, we do get quite a few comments about how reliable these bits of data are. So looking at whether there's any more reliable aspects to that would be interesting. Related to that is this issue of the fact that people that join car clubs go through a bit of a preparation phase. They may take a year, 6 months of thinking about which journeys they can switch to public transport or delivery services, etc., in order to make them ready for that moment where they give up their car or join the car club. So that actual before picture is a little bit more complicated, and it would be interesting to think a bit more about the transition people go through to join a scheme. But actually, at the other end of the scheme, if you compare people to national averages of mileages, that may also, be too blunt a tool, as it, also includes lots of people that are also may not be able to join a scheme. Similarly, the kind of the actual, when we drill down to looking, we've attempted to do carbon calculations. We're looking a lot in terms of average mileages and average emissions. And actually, typically, we tend to net. So just looking at recent figures from our England and Wales survey, overall, we had an average decrease of mileage by about a third of the recipients, of about 2,500 miles. But then there was a group around 20% that actually increased their mileage by around 1,500 miles. And so you then the calculations have been based on a net reduction of around 800 miles. So this is masking quite a lot of differences that there are within that data. And similarly, doesn't really reflect those people that have actually increased or bought a car. What might they have done if they had to buy their own car? How might it have tied them into behaviour that would have linked them more to use of private car? So it feels like there's lots of things going on that are kind of hidden within that data, particularly when you're actually trying to put specific carbon figures onto these things. So my last slide is just kind of looking at our bit of a wish list, and I've split this out into terms of what are the current impacts, how we might assess our current impacts of where we are now, and then how we might assess what the potential might be. So as well as looking at refining some of that kind of data, I think it's really important that we try to drill down and work out what different types of transitions are happening, at what different segments of people that we've got within these membership schemes, and how their behaviour might change over time and be tracked over time. Also on the wish list, I'd really like to be able to understand more about what's happening with the rideshare data and be able to promote the benefits of that in our work. And a very specific thing on my left list is thinking about how shared mobility should be reflected in things like the National Travel Survey. And then I think pretty much related to what Greg was saying about the fact that we have very much focused on specific modes in the past. If you start to look at how all of these modes work as a whole, and then also how they relate to the wider ecosystem around them, then it's a kind of different kettle of fish, really. We're looking at real wholesale lifestyle changes, and so we need to kind of better understand. When we did the research in Scotland and London about the potential, we were kind of having to kind of blanketly assume that all of those positive aspects could be put in place, but which are the most important ones, and what is the relationship between them, and how can that be measured or drilled into it in more detail, and therefore what does it tell us about which of the segments of people that we what are the key factors that we really want to put in place in order to make these things happen. Okay, so hopefully that's kind of given you a bit of a flavour of our thoughts on this. I'm sure I'm really kind of keen to hear everybody else's views on this. There's lots of different perspectives on it, so I hope you can all join us for the next few sessions, and look forward to hearing more about your views on it all.